Hello, everyone. My name is Angela Tobin, and I'm excited to present this presentation around the interplay of trauma, behavior, and the body. And I'm a licensed occupational therapist, so I'll be talking a little bit from that perspective. And also, a lot of what I'll be presenting comes from The Body Keeps the Score and The Whole Brain Child, which are two books I'll mention as well. Just a little agenda about the presentation today. We'll start with an introduction. Then we'll introduce what occupational therapy is, because like I said, that is what I'm licensed as, and I feel like it's a field that's not widely known. So I'm excited to share about it and really why it ties into sensory and the other things I'll be talking about today. Then we'll transition to talking about trauma and how it affects the brain, and we'll really go into some different pictures of the brain and looking at the physiological structures. Then we'll talk about the link between trauma and sensory systems. And this will be really interesting to tie together all the things we'll be talking about. And then finally, we'll be ending on strategies. So make sure you watch all the way through, because I'll be presenting some different strategies to support your child in their sensory needs. A little bit about me. I am an occupational therapist. I graduated from Ohio State University last year, so it's just been a year out of school. I don't currently practice traditionally in receiving clients, but I did complete 2 fieldwork rotations while I was in school, working in a preschool with kiddos, and then also I worked in an inpatient mental health hospital. And currently I run a support group for kinship caregivers in Ohio. And I'm also a researcher and just do research about kinship families. This presentation is kind of a personal interest of mine that I started learning about in school. By no means am I an expert, but I'm excited to bring some of this information to you. And then a little bit about my family. I'm actually from a kinship family. So my grandparents raised their grandson, my cousin, for about 8 years. And unfortunately, they passed away probably about 5 years ago now. My cousin moved in with my parents, which was his aunt and uncle. And I was away at college at the time, but kinship, it doesn't just end when you go to college or when they go to college. So my cousin is in college now and doing well. So I'm excited to be a part of his village still. And kinship care is just something really close to my heart. I know a lot of you all come from backgrounds of having adopted children. So I think this information, and especially the topic of trauma, can be applicable to kinship and adopted families. So we'll start with just defining occupational therapy. I feel like I avoid this a lot of times because it's like simple to explain, but also broad that it's hard to explain. But I'm going to do my best. And if people have questions, feel free to put it in the chat. So occupational therapy is a field that promotes health and well-being through participating in meaningful activities. And when I say meaningful activities, these are the things you do every day that give meaning. So think about it for yourself. What are activities you do every day that provide meaning and purpose for your life? This can be being a caregiver. This can also be if you go to work and, attend a job, or this can also be social events. There's so many different things that make up our everyday lives. And as occupational therapists, we just want to promote health and well-being through being able to participate in these activities. Occupations, although it sounds like a job, it's not. It refers to it's a lot more general than that. So it refers to activities people need to, want to, and are expected to do. And like I said, you can even think about your own day. And there's things we need to do every day, like showering, brushing our teeth. Sometimes we do need to go to work. And then there's those activities we want to do, and then what we're expected of as well. I love occupational therapy because we really think of well-being very holistically. In the medical field, it can be very reductionist, or we can tend to separate physical health from mental health. But in occupational therapy, we define well-being as health, independence, dignity, life fulfillment, so much more broadly. So in summary, we help people do the things that they need to and they want to do. We work in a variety of settings. So we work from little infants to older adults and everything in between. So we learn a lot about child development, life development in general. And it's been really cool to just be able to see the way occupational therapy can help people across the lifespan. And I'll be talking more from experience with kids. But like I said, we can work in all different types of fields, and really occupational therapy can be a great support to your kiddo if it's something that they qualify for, or if you're interested in learning more about it. You're always welcome to ask the occupational therapist in the school or find an outpatient clinic. But we'll be talking about some specific occupational therapy interventions today. Just to give some examples of occupations, these are all the different things. A lot of them we do every day without thinking about, but for some people, kids and adults, they do need extra assistance in doing these everyday activities and becoming independent in them. So some activities include showering, feeding, dressing, toileting, brushing your teeth. If you have young kiddos, I'm sure you're working on all of these activities with them and guiding them through it. We also have instrumental activities of daily living, and these are things that go beyond the basics, but are still very much part of our daily lives. So this can include caretaking, keeping a clean house, managing a home, driving, financial management. We also support health management, rest and sleep. This is actually a very important occupation that we don't think about, but if you're not sleeping well, then it can affect everything else in your daily life. Education, so with kids, supporting them to use their skills to get everything out of school experience that they can. Work, and then play and leisure. So just these are all the things we think about, and we can provide supports in social participation. And I will say most children, adults who are in occupational therapy have some sort of physical impairment, or it can be a mental impairment that impairs their ability to participate in an age-appropriate activity, which it could be any of these activities. So with adults, we'll work with all different conditions, but most commonly adults with stroke, and also different neurological disorders. And for kids, a lot of times we work with kiddos with developmental disabilities, including autism, ADHD, or if they have genetic conditions, physical impairments. But yeah, I'm just excited to share more. So we really look at the whole picture, how a person and their interests, their beliefs, their skills interact with that activity they're expected to do, they need to do, they want to do, and how the environment supports them or doesn't support them. So we really look at the whole picture, and we can work on building up a person's skills in order to be able to complete the activity better or more easily, or we can work on adapting the environment in order to allow the person to still participate in that activity that they have to. And the goal is really participation in daily life. There's something called the Just Right Challenge in occupational therapy, and it's all about finding the right balance. So I mentioned we can build skills in children and adults that we work with, really building on those skills that they need. For example, if it's, dressing, what are the skills you use to put on a shirt? But then also, once a person's physical abilities or skills kind of reach the highest point they can, we also work on adapting the environment to support them in participating in everyday life. So an example of adaptation is moving a child closer to the board so they can see the board. Or it can be using, we'll talk about sensory adaptation, so changing the environment around them in order for them to feel more regulated and comfortable. Okay, so we're going to look at the big picture and really going to focus on sensory today, but I want to show you how it all fits in. So like I said, a person interacts with their environment, with the activities they do. We have all of these things as people in our executive functioning. So our attention, our thoughts, our judgment, our decision-making, these are all upstairs brain skills. We'll talk more about that. And in the environment, we also have things that support us or things that don't. So this we can think about as behavior or performance, how we act on our environment. But we don't really think about how our environment acts on us and how we take in the environment. And this is called sensory, the sensory system. The environment is giving us sensory input. And this can affect our arousal level and our environmental processing, which can then affect our attention, thoughts, our judgment, and decision-making and our behavior and performance. So as occupational therapists, we really specialize in sensory, which I feel like is a missing piece when looking at behavior and how a child is acting, and also with trauma. So we'll talk more about that. So this is kind of the whole picture, and today we'll focus on sensory. And this is just an example of how sensory interacts with us. So just a different way to look at that chart. We have the external world, all of these different senses that we have heard so often. So sight, touch, hearing, smelling, proprioception, vestibular. So these are giving input to us, and they're interacting with our inner worlds and our feelings. So fear, numb, joy. And then we have different reactions to this, including our arousal level, our body temperature, and our breathing, depending on the emotions we're feeling. So if we're stressed, we're going to perceive the environment differently than when we're joyful. And this all leads to our sense of self. So now we'll start transitioning. We'll transition to talk about trauma and how it affects the brain. A lot of this, just understanding of the brain. Well, first, actually, we're just going to talk about the brain in general. Then we're going to bring it to trauma. So this understanding of the brain is based on The Whole Brain Child by Dr. Daniel Siegel and Dr. Tina Payne. It's a really great book. I highly recommend it. And we're going to learn about the upstairs brain and the downstairs brain. I have a video that I think explains it really well.
Your brain is powerful and strong. It helps you remember that 2 + 2 = 4, makes you blink and breathe without even thinking, and even helps you play your favorite video games. But it's so much more than that, too. Your brain has 3 main parts: the cerebrum, the cerebellum, and the brainstem. It also has 2 sides, a left and a right, 4 lobes, the frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital. And then each of these lobes can be broken down even more into areas that have specific jobs. Yowza, that's a lot of pieces. Let's see if we can make it a bit easier to understand. You can think of your brain kind of like a 2-story house. In this house, there's an upstairs and a downstairs. The upstairs and downstairs brains both have very important jobs. Your downstairs brain's job is to keep you safe. It is responsible for things like breathing, super strong emotions like anger and fear, and watching out for danger. The upstairs brain's job is to help you think. Yep, that's right. Its job is to help you problem solve, learn, and make good decisions. A house wouldn't be a home without people inside, right? Your brain has some characters in it that play a really important role in what you're thinking, feeling, and doing. Let's talk about the characters in the downstairs brain first. Down here, you have alerting Annie. She lets us know if there's danger nearby. Angry Albert. He responds really quickly with, you guessed it, anger. And frightened Fred. He's pretty much scared of everything, but it's because he wants to keep us safe. Then there's the boss. This is Big Boss Bob. His job is to take information from Albert, Annie, and Fred and react. There is no thinking involved. He just listens to them, and if they say danger is nearby, he acts super fast. Bob does this in 3 different ways: fight, flight, or freeze. Your upstairs brain has some characters in it too. Up here, you have problem-solving Patty. She helps recognize problems and come up with solutions. Calming Carl. His job is to help us calm down when we're upset. Flexible Felix. He allows us to go with the flow. And focusing Frank. He allows us to pay attention and learn. All of these characters don't act super fast. It takes time for them to stop and think before doing anything. Any house with an upstairs and downstairs has a staircase that connects them, right? So does your brain house. We need both the upstairs and downstairs brains to work together. When the brain's staircase is built and strong, our characters can move up and down the staircase to share information. This allows the upstairs brain to try and make sense of strong emotions from Albert, Annie, and Fred, and try to figure out how to help. But it's not always that easy. You see, even though your downstairs brain is done being built when you're born, your upstairs brain is under construction until you're in your mid-20s, which means your staircase can be kind of fragile as a kid. And Bob is kind of bossy. So when he thinks that danger is around, he may flip a switch to break your staircase in order to keep you safe, even when there's no actual danger around. Let's look at it this way.
All right, we're going to stop it here. So we'll mention some of those characters as we go through the presentation, but you can see the downstairs brain is our initial reaction to things. Its job is to keep us safe. And our upstairs brain, where we have emotional regulation and judgment and those other things, that's things have to pass through the downstairs brain before making it to the upstairs brain and accessing those functions. So now we'll talk about trauma and how this can affect how the upstairs brain and the downstairs brain works. A definition of trauma, I'm sure you all might have learned about trauma in other presentations too. And I will say trauma is not my area of expertise. I've definitely learned about it through reading articles and things like that. But I'm just going to provide a general overview of it now because I really do want to spend more time on the sensory side of things. But if you have questions, definitely feel free to ask. So trauma results from an event, a series of events, or a set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotional harmful or threatening, and that can have a lasting adverse effect on the individual's functioning. So I have bolded it's experienced by an individual because trauma isn't necessarily the event itself. It's about how a person experiences that event. So two people can be at the same event and experience it differently. Different types of trauma. So there's acute trauma, and this is resulting from one specific event. Chronic and complex trauma are events that happen over time. So when we think about childhood trauma, abuse, neglect, if it happens over time, it can fall into these categories. And a main distinction between chronic trauma and complex trauma is complex trauma is something that happens over time, and it's if the abuser or whoever it is a trusted individual that the person knows. So there's an aspect of attachment involved. And it's a sense of betrayal. And when we think about childhood trauma, a lot of this can fall into complex trauma. So we do have different trauma responses, and we're going to come back to these throughout the presentation, thinking about when we feel like we're in danger, what is our reaction? We can react in different ways, and it's different for different people. So first is fight. This can come out through anger, irritability, aggression. If, you see someone who comes up and looks threatening and might be trying to, rob from you or steal from you, maybe you try to fight them. Or we also have flight, and this is escaping a situation. So when we think of that situation, it's running away as fast as you can to escape the situation. And over time, if we're, thinking about the complex trauma that happens, flight can come up with fear and anxiety. It can also come up in perfectionism. It's a person's fear of making a mistake and not wanting to deal with that situation. And then freeze. So this means your body pretty much immobilizes and you just freeze. And over time, this can look like zoning out, being stuck. We'll talk about dissociation and detachment, where your brain dissociates from the environment around you. So this is another coping skill. And then finally, fawn, which I haven't heard about this one until recently, but I think it's really interesting. It's means people pleasing, avoiding conflict, and you have difficulty saying no. So you're trying to people please in order to avoid conflict because you don't want a bad event to happen if you're not pleasing the people around you. And these are things that can be learned over time. So a lot of this information will come from The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. We're going to look more into the brain, and I want you to think about the last video we watched as well. So the brain develops from the bottom up. So we have the brain stem. So this is the downstairs brain, the limbic area, which is part of the downstairs brain, but also is part of the demanding bob that determines whether we're safe or not and determines if we can use the staircase to get to the upstairs brain. And this is also called the midbrain. And then we have the cortex and the prefrontal cortex. This is the upstairs brain that helps with our judgment, our emotional regulation, our problem-solving skills. So now we're going to consider how trauma affects all of these sections of the brain. So this is about the same thing, just different pictures of the structure. The brainstem, so this is what keeps us alive. Arousal, sleep, wake, how we feel hungry, breathing, chemical balance, limbic brain, map of, we'll go more into this. Okay, so I hope this picture isn't too confusing, but I'll try to walk you through everything. And we're going to talk about how information comes into the brain and is processed. So sensory input, so that just means all of the things around us, our surroundings, and this is surroundings from the external world and also our internal world, come in the thalamus, and they're integrated together. And then the thalamus, which is part of the brainstem, sends the information to the amygdala. This is what we can think of as bossy Bob. This is what determines if the situation we're in is safe or not. And The Body Keeps the Score, Bessel van der Kolk calls it the smoke detector. So if information comes in and it's determined that the environment around us is not safe, the amygdala is going to immediately tell the brain to deliver stress hormones. So now we're in a state of fight, flight, freeze, or fawn automatically. So it doesn't consult anyone else. But say that information comes in and it is determined that it's safe, it's going to take a longer route to the upstairs brain. So these green ones we can think of as the staircase. So the hippocampus is where we integrate memories. And then the cingulate cortex is our brain kind of integrating the environment around us as well. And then we make it to the prefrontal cortex, the upstairs. And this is where we can make those decisions and judgments and emotionally regulate. But like I said, the path to the upstairs brain is longer than the downstairs brain. So if the brain thinks we're in danger and it needs an immediate response, we're just going to secrete the stress hormones right away. There's a watchtower in the prefrontal cortex. That's what the Body Keeps the Score calls it as well. And this is our ability to learn about what information is safe and not. So it's ability to predict if a situation is safe, not just base it off of sensory information. But this is also in the upstairs brain and a skill that develops over time. And then here's a picture of the smoke detector, which just reacts immediately to an unsafe situation. So let's talk about functioning of the upstairs brain, the prefrontal cortex, multisensory information. So this is our ability to not only process the environment around us, but adapt to it. For example, if your house is too cold, you notice it's too cold, you turn the heat up. If you're driving a car and you see someone pull in front of you, you might have to stop really quick. So it's our ability to process the information around us, but also make those changes to keep us safe and comfortable. Social interaction, a sense of agency and a sense of ourself, our ability to make decisions and interact in the world around us, and then also emotional regulation. So all of these things we have access to in our upstairs brain. But with children with trauma, they might just only be able to access their downstairs brain if they're in an environment that feels unsafe, or if they're in an environment that's triggering memories from the past that feel unsafe. And over time, your body can learn to just be in a state of fight or flight or freeze all of the time. So I want you to think about different physical reactions, how you feel when you're stressed or you're afraid, and you can add that to the chat. Some physical reactions we have are that your heart rate increases, you feel tense, you might even shut down, you might close your eyes to try to zone out the world around you, you might want to scream, you want to pull your hair out. It's interesting because, and the body keeps the score, Vessel Vanderhook makes the point that a lot of the expressions we use day to day tie how our mental state affects our physical state too. For example, like this is a heartbreaking situation. When something's really sad, I'm sick to my stomach, thinking when you're upset over something, you feel sick to your stomach. And then also wanting to pull your hair out when you're stressed. So all of our feelings in our brain do affect our body as well. And when our brain tells our body that we should, fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, we have reactions that go along with that, including heart rate, like a heart rate increase, and even just like shutting down. So, and it's shown that children who've experienced complex trauma may develop chronic or recurrent physical complaints such as headache and stomach aches. Adult with histories of trauma and childhood have been shown to have more chronic physical conditions and problems. There is something called the polyvagal nerve theory, and this is a nerve that ties the brain with internal organs of the body, and it talks more about this, brain gut connection as well. But just think about being in a state of stress. Our bodies can handle it for a short period of time, but that chronic state of stress can really change our physiology and also how we process the things around us. I'm not going to go too much into a definition of PTSD, but there is 4 different factors. Intrusion, which means you have intrusive thoughts about the event that was distressing. Avoidance, avoiding triggers that might bring up those intrusive thoughts or feelings. What we will talk about is alterations in cognition and mood. And this can change a person's ability to pay attention, to regulate how they're feeling or what their thoughts are. And then alterations in arousal and activity. This is one we'll especially focus on, being at a state of hypervigilance or even dissociation. And those 2 words will break down as well. So hypervigilance, or the hyperreactive type of PTSD, is when you're aroused and more sensitive to the environment around you. So you're looking for those threats, you're on edge. If you hear a noise, you might be more triggered by it. So you're just looking for potential threats to stay safe more than other people. And this is kind of what is traditionally thought of as PTSD, but there is also another type, which is dissociative type. And this can happen if your body learns that my alarm system is broken, I'm reacting to everything, and this is exhausting. And then a dissociative type can happen where your brain actually kind of just like disconnects from the environment. And it's like, all right, I'm done processing things around me. I'm just going to, feel numb to the world around me. And approximately 14 to 30% of traumatized individuals present with the dissociative type. And this is often associated with complex childhood trauma. So we're going to talk about later on hyperactive, dissociative, how this comes up in sensory. And like I said, I'm not a trauma expert, so I'm sorry if these explanations aren't super clear and detailed, but we will tie it all back together. This is other ways that trauma can look like. We have, that thought of our head of trauma of like the soldier coming back from the war and he's in a hardware store and here's a hammer drop, and then all of a sudden he's back having those flashbacks. But that's not the only way trauma shows up. It can show up in attachment and relationships, in someone's mood and arousal, and how they see themselves. So Bessel van der Kolk is going to talk a little bit about other ways that trauma can show up just outside of the way we might think of.
What can happen when trauma?
Sorry, just trying to get it to the right spot.
Trauma. And what we see when we look at those kids is that, and these kids as they grow older, that their problems aren't very different from PTSD. Their problems are.
And he's talking about children who've experienced childhood trauma.
It has to do with attention, being able to focus in on something and to engage with something in a very steady, consistent way. So they get thrown off, they have a hard time really focusing on things, sticking with things, concentrating on things, filtering irrelevant stuff out, so they get hijacked. So that's one very big issue, which deserves its own whole special series of treatments. The second thing is the core issue of affect regulation. And that is that we have our emotions in order to tell us what to do and where to go, to orient our bodies, our minds to the reality around us. Traumatized people's emotions become too large, too extreme, or they become too quiet. And once they get activated, unlike people who are relatively doing pretty well, and you get upset, and 10 minutes later, you're fine again. You go back to work. And so chronically traumatized people keep getting stuck. And something happened yesterday, and today they're still out of sorts about it, and tomorrow they're still out of sorts about it, and their whole weekend is hijacked by something that's happened. And then they deal with that hijacking by trying to calm themselves down in any way they can. And that's where the whole issue of drugs and alcohol comes in, and self-mutilation and eating disorders, because they all seem to be chronic adaptations to this affect dysregulation problem that you see in this population. The third area is in the area of relationships. So if somebody has messed with you, you have a basic perception of the world that people will hurt you, will make you not feel safe, that you're helpless, that people are going to mess with you. So you position yourself in the world as somebody who should always protect herself, or as somebody who should be aggressive or arrogant or distant or dependent and compliant and please everybody, because if you stand up for yourself, terrible things will happen to yourself. And so there's the main sort of three different areas. So it's not about memory, but it's the formation of the self, the brain, the mind, and bodily.
So you hear there, it's not just about the memories, gets more integrated in your sense of self and how you process the world around you. And I do want to go back to this visual. One thing I wanted to mention is our feelings and our state at the time can influence how this system works, right? So if we're feeling hyper-aroused and on edge, the world is not safe around me, this amygdala is going to kick in more. So the smoke detector is going to go off more often. Maybe that's a threat. Maybe that's a threat. So then it's just this endless cycle. It's kind of a positive feedback cycle where things in the environment that might remind you of trauma or make you feel a way that reminds you of trauma is going to tell you to release stress hormones and be on edge over time. So really our internal state can affect how the system works, and then how the system works can also affect our internal state. Okay, so before we transition more into the sensory side of things, I did want to take a quote from The Body Keeps the Score. And it says, trauma victims cannot recover until they become familiar with and befriend sensations of the body. Being frightened means you live in a body that's always on guard. In order to change, people need to become aware of their sensations and the way their bodies interact with the world around them. Physical self-awareness is the first step in releasing the tyranny of the past. So he's really arguing it's not just trauma in our head but how we interact the world around us with our bodies, and having this physical self-awareness that children who experience trauma might not have as strongly. And the book does go into more recommendations for therapy, like body-based therapies, somatic sensory therapies. And some of these include like EMDR therapy, if you've heard of that, eye movement desensitization therapy. There's also something called neurofeedback therapy, trauma sensitive yoga. Like I said, these aren't my areas of expertise, but if you're interested in reading the book, and I also have some resources at the end of learning about these different somatic psychotherapy types, then you're welcome to. But now we'll link trauma and sensory processing. So as we mentioned earlier, sensory processing is our body's ability to take in the environment around us. So statistics show that children who have experienced trauma, or adults too, are more likely to also have difficulties in sensory processing and processing the world around them. There's a study that showed about half of the children who've experienced trauma also has deficits in sensory processing. Excuse me. There's also other diagnoses that overlap with difficulty in sensory processing, and this includes autism and ADHD as well. So a lot of the sensory things we'll talk about from OT originated in working with children with autism and ADHD and different developmental disabilities, but can apply to children who've experienced trauma as well. And what's interesting too is there is an overlap. It's called like differential diagnosis, when symptoms might look similar between different disorders. And also people say there's a bi-directional relationship between ADHD and PTSD as well, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So you could see even how in the last video we heard that childhood trauma can affect attention. So that might be diagnosed by ADHD as well. So all of this to say a lot of these conditions might have overlapping roots of their cause or physiological causes. And there is also some evidence for sensory-based interventions for children who've experienced trauma in occupational therapy and in other fields as well. So that's been very cool to see this kind of being a new area that population we work with. So sensory really does make up your sense of self. If you think about it, our ability to process our environment around us and act on it, that makes up what we do every day and who we are. So if we're processing the environment differently, we might feel lost or confused or lose control over our sense of self because we don't feel like we have control over what we act on. So this just goes to show how different feelings can affect our processing of the environment. So if you're on edge all the time and the world is unsafe, so this would be someone who experiences hyperarousal, they might have higher arousal in their sight and their sound around them. Their heart rate might increase and they might feel more fearful of the environment around them. So they're not able to take it in as a person who's regulated. I feel dead inside, so this might be someone experiencing dissociation. So they decrease their ability to process touch and where they are in the environment, and their arousal might decrease. They might just start to feel numb to the environment around them. And then I felt loved as a child. So this is someone who is healthy brain, and their sense of touch and sight, are regulated, and they're able to feel joy in their environment and really take in what's around them because they're regulated. So sensory integration The definition of this is our nervous system's ability to organize all the channels of sensory input and then adapt to the environment. So this is a two-parter, taking it in and then also adapting. We do this naturally in our everyday life. I work from home, so I feel like I've taken this to the next level. I have an adjustable light. I have, a space heater in my office, and I'm really able to adapt the environment based on how I'm feeling. Sometimes if I'm tired, I might want to turn the light on to make me feel more woken up, or if I'm feeling overwhelmed, I might want to turn the light off. So it's our ability to process what's around us, but then also adapt the environment to us or adapt to the environment. It's important to know that people process the same sensory stimuli in different ways. So kind of going back to trauma, it's not what the sensory information is, it's how a person is experiencing it. There's different sensory profiles we'll talk about, but some people thrive in crowded rooms and loud concerts, and other people thrive in quiet environments and might feel overwhelmed in crowded rooms. So we all process the same stimuli in different ways, and it's all about learning how you process the environment as a caregiver, and also the children you care for process the environment and different stimuli. And we can be sensitive in some areas, like I can be more sensitive to visual input or auditory input, but less sensitive to tactile input. So it can really be different for everyone. So we do have 5 senses we've heard about often, which include sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch. But we also have hidden senses that we don't talk about as often that I want to present here. So we have the vestibular system. This is our balance and our spatial orientation. We determine where we are in space. So an example of like an impaired vestibular system is people who have vertigo, or if you have poor balance or poor coordination. So the vestibular system helps us determine where we are in space. And even my vestibular system is saying, I need more vestibular input because I rock back and forth on my chair. So it can be regulating too. Proprioception is our awareness of our position of our body and movement. So an example of proprioception is you close your eyes and you put your arms out. You can know your arms are out based on the signals your muscles are sending to your brain. Interoception is the functioning of our internal organs. So it's how we know when we're hungry, how we know when our heart rate's high, how we know when we have to go to the bathroom. So these are other senses that can be impaired or changed with different sensory systems. So sensory modulation, this is what we can think of this as our arousal to the environment. This is what allows us to turn the volume up or down to the world around us. And this is a top brain function we'll talk about. So it can affect our arousal and our sensitivity to sensory input. Our body can react to different types of sensory inputs in different ways. So it's like what I said. The main thing about sensory modulation, it helps us determine what's important in our environment. So right now I have a space or an air filter going in my office. My brain's kind of turned that sound off and I don't hear it because it's not important. It's a background noise. And, if I hear a car go by really fast, my attention is going to go there to make sure everything's okay outside. So it's like just our ability to determine what's important in the environment. And children who've experienced trauma or have different sensory systems might not have as much ability. And we've learned earlier about just feeling unsafe all the time and not sure what stimuli is okay and what's not. So modulation mixes everything together and tells us what's important from all of our senses. So the sensory information coming in comes in through our brainstem, and sensory modulation is a top brain function. So we need to be able to access to the top brain in order to use it. It's like a watchtower. It tells us what to pay attention to. So we're going to talk about different arousal levels and how sensory information can be perceived differently based on a person's arousal level. And all of these are different kind of sensory profiles we'll talk about. So it can change day to day, but these are general trends of what children or adults might show and how they process the environment. So on the bottom of this, you'll see different sensory events that happen throughout the day. And these are just things we have to process. They're sensory events that happen all day long to us, but how someone reacts to different sensory events. We'll give an example. So first we'll talk about someone who experiences optimal arousal, who's regulated. So say they wake up, they hear their alarm, it wakes them up a little bit, and then they're able to calm back down, get ready, do the things they need to do, and say they're kind of rushing to get to the bus. So let's say a big sensory event happens, so something that's overwhelming to them. So let's say they get to school and the teacher is getting everyone in line and it's really loud and they're getting confused about where to go. So they might start to feel stressed and more on edge trying to do that. But then once they get to the classroom, they're able to calm back down. So it's really not the event itself, but the ability to calm back down and regulate after a sensory event. So then let's say it's recess time, you get your energy back up, and then it's lunch and you're excited to talk to your friends. And then once you get back to the classroom, you're able to get back into stay regulated in that state. But with all of this, you're able to take in the environment around you and make decisions to act on the environment. So now we'll talk about something called sensory overload. And this is when the senses get overwhelmed, and we can say it's like a traffic jam. Everything coming in feels overwhelming and you stop being able to process everything around you. You kind of shut down. So let's say the same thing. So let's say you're rushing to get to school and you're feeling overwhelmed by the bus. You're riding the bus. There's a lot of noise around you, and you see cars moving really fast around you. So then once you get to school, you're on high arousal. Oh, I meant to talk about this one. It could be either of these two, the orange or the purple. Because the orange, you start in the morning okay, but then you're kind of unable to get back down to that regulated state. But some kids are always, hypersensitive to the environment. So we'll talk about this kid. The bus comes and overwhelmed on the bus. You get to class and let's say there's a recess activity and then you feel nervous because there's a change in the routine at school. So there's just different examples you can use. But pretty much your arousal is up the whole time and you feel on edge and there's too much information coming in around you. And then low arousal, these are kids who have trouble registering the things around us. They're under responsive to the environment. So let's say this is where you're able to, process information and act on the environment, but things aren't really registering as much. So you hear the alarm, you wake up a little bit, you're on the bus and there's loud noises and you can start to register that around you. In recess, you get your energy up and you're able to participate in that. But then with learning and attention, your arousal level goes back down. So these are all different kind of profiles and different ways people can react to the same set of circumstances. So we talked about different sensory profiles, we'll call them. And I'll say like sensory differences are normal. We all have sensory differences. There are something called sensory disorders in occupational therapy. It's not a standalone diagnosis, but it's when a person's ability to process sensory information affects their everyday functioning. So we all have sensory differences, but these ones I'll talk about are more on the disorder side of things where it might impair a person to interact with the environment. And like I said, sensory responses can be different with each sense, but these are general profiles, like going back to the arousal level in the chart. So sensory over responsivity or being more sensitive is when a person is more sensitive to sensory inputs than the people around them. So this can be the example when we think about trauma, hyperarousal, being on fight or flight mode. This can be described as a person feeling overstimulated. So there's too much information coming in at once. And it can look like a person shutting down because they feel like there's a jam and they can't process the information. So this is going to affect their attention and their ability to act on the environment. And they might shut down more easily. And if you think about it, if you're overwhelmed, how might that affect your attention? Think about when you're feeling stressed or there's so much going on. So we're going to watch a video of sensory overload. And if we go back to the chart, this kid is on sensory overload all the time. It's too much input coming in at once. And this is what it might be experienced like. So can you all guess, based watching on that video, what senses that child is sensitive to? So we heard loud sounds amplified, so sounds sound louder to him. That'd be hearing. And then also we saw the lights flickering, so visual was very overstimulating to him. So as we can see here, his brain wasn't able to determine to modulate that information and turn down the volume of the world around him. And like we said with PTSD, if you're on hyperarousal, your brain might be telling you to hear those things louder and you don't have that ability. So that can correspond with sensory processing over responsivity. So now we'll talk about under responsivity. So this is the opposite. This is the blue on the chart. So this is when you're disconnected from the environment around you and you're not able to process information as easily. The information doesn't come through as easily. And like I said, this can be different for different senses, but in general, you don't register things as much. And this can be when a person is less likely to notice or react to their environment. So when we think about dissociation, when the brain kind of disconnects and dissociates with the environment, you feel numb inside. You don't have a visceral reaction to the things around you. This might correlate to under responsivity. And there's things that we look for in OT to kind of identify this. And this can be like being clumsy and bumping into things, not noticing the things in the environment. Have you ever gone into a pantry and not been able to find what you're looking for? Kind of that happening all the time. You can't visually identify the things you need to in your environment. You don't notice when you're being touched. And it might also show up in poor motor skills, poor handwriting. So under responsivity is the opposite. You're not processing things in the environment as much. And if you don't notice the things in your environment, how might this affect your ability to pay attention and respond if we're thinking in a classroom? You're not noticing things around you. So this can really have a great effect as well. I wish I could find a video of that one, but I couldn't find a good one just because the hyperarousal is more commonly focused on in sensory, but this definitely shows up. And then we have sensory seeking. This a lot of times can go along with sensory under responsivity. So I'm not getting enough from the environment to regulate me as is. I need to get more from the environment. I need to go to the environment to get more input in order to feel regulated. So these kids might feel restless without that more input. So you seek out more intense sensory experiences. This can look like kids who are always hyper, or those who can never get their energy out. So we see kids doing big movements, always running, always jumping, difficulty sitting still, fidgeting all the time. It can also be like doing different interesting things, like eating chalk in order to get a more intense sensory experience. That's an example. But really, these kids are involved in a lot of big movements. They like messy play. And like I said, it can go along with being under responsive to the environment. You're seeking more. And I will say, like I said, all of these aren't necessarily a direct response to trauma, because sensory processing disorders happen across different diagnoses, not just trauma, but maybe a change in the neurological system, a change in how your brain processes the body can also change how you process the senses around you. So this is some pictures for sensory seeking kids. And if you're feeling restless, how might this affect your attention to the environment? So that same question, when I'm feeling restless, I need to, go for a walk. I need to be able to maybe work out or get my energy out before I can sit down and focus, or else my brain is just in so many different directions. So we're talking about using our body and the world around us to help us feel regulated. And with that, we'll talk about sensory supports and interventions. Some are occupational therapy specific, and then some are things you can do at home. So thinking about the pyramid of learning, sensory is at the bottom, and I keep bringing this question back to attention because with behavior, this is such an upper brain function. And in order to even decide on how we're going to interact with the environment, our attention, what we're paying attention to, what we're able to process determines that too. So it's not necessarily a choice, but just what our body pays attention to. And sensory processing is even underneath attention. So how our body takes in sensory input and what is the input around us. So we really do have to think about behavior and learning as a high-end function because it's determined by so much else. So again, the just right challenge, the how and sensory. So if we think about adaptation, changing the environment around a child in order for them to feel more regulated, that would be an example of adaptation. And then remediation or skill building is sensory integration. And this is a very specific occupational therapy intervention that's done with an occupational therapist. And it teaches a child different strategies for integrating the sensory, integrating the environment around them with different senses and how they can adapt to the environment. So SI therapy, sensory integration, was developed by Jean Ayres, and she's kind of like the founder of sensory and OT. She has written a really great book as well. And it teaches children with sensory difficulties, skills in regulating and coping with different sensory inputs through self-directed play activities. So this is all through play. And it tries to build up the child's skills to take in different sensory information that might be hard for them to take in. And this is all about the sensory experience around them, but also the child's ability to adapt to the environment, which we call kind of finding the just right challenge for kids. So like I said, there's tons of sensory clinics for occupational therapy. It can be like an outpatient normally it's like an outpatient setting. So if you're interested in sensory therapy with an occupational therapist, then this might be something to look into, and get your child evaluated for. Like I said, occupational therapy only normally can help people outside of the norm, but certainly it could be worth looking into. And what we'll focus more on what you can do as a parent is the sensory adaptation side of things. So changing the environment to support a child's optimal arousal level. And this can be done at home. Hopefully there's strategies in school as well. And this is something you could talk to your school occupational therapist about too, if you have concerns about your child's sensory processing. But there's two strategies I'll mention today. A sensory diet is an established, individualized routine that is implemented to support a child throughout the day. So this can be done in school or at home. And it's just like a sensory routine. I feel like diet is kind of a weird word, but it helps the child throughout different points in the day. So when they come to school, say a child is, let's say a child is hypersensitive to the environment. They come to school, they're able to access a quiet environment around them to regulate in the beginning of the day. They're able to wear headphones during different times of the day that might be louder during recess, during lunch. They may be able to, do a quiet activity or have a quiet corner in the classroom that they can go to. Or if a child's needing more input, say they're under registration sensory seeking, then maybe in the beginning of the day, they can walk a lap around the school building. They can do different tasks, such as even wiping off the chalkboard can be regulating, or it's something called we call heavy work, or carrying heavy books to another classroom. So different things throughout the day. And also, like I said, that can be done at home. And this can look like, having time outside before doing homework when coming home in order to help regulate the body before having a task that requires attention. And then we'll talk about building a sensory room or a calming corner for kids as well. So sensory supports are different to each child, and each child has a different recipe for optimal regulation. Each person does. So this is all about learning your child's preferences. There is a checklist that's free that I include at the end of the presentation that can help. But like I said, some people can want more vestibular input or proprioceptive input in order to feel regulated. Other kids might need less visual input, less auditory. A lot of times those two things go together, visual and auditory. So it's really just learning about the kid and helping a child feel regulated and safe in their environment so they can use that staircase to access their higher brain functionings. That's the important part here. How can we help a child access their higher brain functioning, such as attention, judgment, emotional regulation, by adapting the environment for them to feel safe? So again, we're changing the environment. We're changing even the information coming into their brain. So supports for high arousal kids. These are, like I said, hypersensitive to the environment, might be more on edge. I mentioned some of these earlier, but developing a calming corner and letting the child decide what feels good to them. A lot of times having an enclosed space where the area around them is small, dimmed lights, you can have relaxing music or even sound. So just having the child help you build that calming corner. If you have space in your house, it can even be a closet. It doesn't need to be a big space, but somewhere the child knows that they can go if they're feeling overstimulated. Headphones can be great. They have really fun headphones of different characters now. So for sound, headphones could be an adaptation. And like I said, a quiet space. Using low lights can help with visual input, or also even putting a sheet over your lights so it's less abrasive. For proprioceptive input, we've learned in OT school that this is always very calming. When we're feeling stressed, we just want to hug, or we hug ourselves, right? To self-stimulate, to self-soothe. So hugging your kids, certainly, but also weighted blankets, there's weighted vests, there's different weighted products, weighted stuffed animals that a child can use to help calm them down. This is important, using a low and soft tone of voice. So if a child's overstimulated and they might be yelling, they might be, closing their eyes and covering their ears, trying to get out of the situation. Responding to that situation with more sound or volume is probably only going to make it worse. So being sure to use a low and soft tone of voice. Scheduling in breaks throughout the day where they can access this calming corner. And then swinging back and forth can also be really relaxing. If you have a swing, most people don't have a swing in their home, but if you go to the playground or they're at recess, swinging back and forth can be really relaxing. And avoiding light touch, because light touch can sometimes be overstimulating. And especially if we think about kids who've experienced trauma and may have had, poor experiences with touch, this can be something to just be aware of. And with all of this, always taking the child's direction and asking their permission, asking their thoughts about what they like for things. And if they're too young or they're nonverbal, really just seeing how they react in different situations. So here's an example, a little fort with pillows. Here's a pair of headphones. This is kind of an over-the-top sensory room, but there's some different things you can see here. So now we're going to talk about supports for children with low arousal who need more input from the environment to process it, or who don't have as easy of a time noticing the things around them. So this, you want to bring the environment to life a little bit more. Include bright colors and music, and make sure you're getting their attention before starting a task. Or, if you're playing a game with them or completing homework with them, just make sure you're having their attention, because they might lose their attention more easily. And you can even do a warm-up activity before to try to engage their brain more. This can be stretching, dancing, have a little dance party. Something to try to get their body arousal level up. It's important to give directions and repeat them as needed, because kids who don't process as easily may not understand them or hear them the first time, and maybe saying things in different ways as well. So that can be auditory. Sensory bins, especially like tactile sensory bins. There's so many things online where you can get ideas for sensory bins. Fluctuating your tone of voice, to make the sound more interesting and keep them engaged throughout. Play games with large muscle movements. So this is to activate their different body systems and for them to be able to feel their body in different areas in space. So this can be like twister or hopscotch, any outdoor activities. Swinging in different directions can increase their arousal level. If you're at a park and have a swing. And then sensory seekers, so this really goes along with the last one too, but those who are really seeking more from their environment, like I said, those high energy, hyper kids. And a lot of this, it's important to do before a task that requires attention or before a hard task, like before doing homework at the end of the day. So big movement, those same big movements we talked about, there's a video with different ideas. If you can have like a little beanbag they can run and crash into. Heavy work tasks, this means like pushing or pulling or carrying heavy books. It's giving them proprioceptive input, and this can be very regulating as well. Having an activity corner or space they can go to let out their energy in your house, or getting outside when it's warm out. I know it's hard, especially during the winter time, but just little things can make a really big difference in the home. Different sensory tools, so fidget toys, if they're if you notice that they have a hard time sitting still and they're fidgety with their hands, using weighted blankets too. Schedule in a playtime, just as you would schedule in breaks for children who have hyper responsive sensory systems. Schedule in times where they can get their energy out and get the input they need from their environment. Engage a child in activities before a task that requires focus, and give specific instructions for using an item, because sensory seekers kind of like explore a lot with the environment around them. Like I said, eating chalk is an example, so just giving specific instructions. So we can see some examples here. This is like if you have multiple kids rolling each other in a blanket, sensory bins, a beanbag. These little poppers are really fun. So sensory seeking may not be as common like commonly related to trauma, but this is just another sensory profile we see of kids. And a lot of times this does co-occur with like ADHD as well. So it's all about creating a sensory routine and also observing how a child is and what is triggering to a child, what is comforting a child and reacting to that. Creating positive sensory experiences is so important. We don't want to just protect from negative experiences, but create positive ones and really following your child's lead on that. Okay, so we're going to close out. I'm almost to the end here, but this is from the Whole Brain Child 2, and it talks about the steps in engaging the upper brain. And I hate to keep bringing it back to this, but I think it's just such an important point, because when children are misbehaving or not doing the things that they're supposed to when we expect them to, and say they're in a meltdown, say they're feeling overstimulated, or they just can't process the environment around them, sometimes our reaction is to want to go up to them and reason with them. Why aren't you doing this? Why aren't you doing that? Can you please calm down? Without giving them other tools. And the fact is they can't really access their reasoning part of their brain until they're able to regulate. So how can we help them regulate first, relate to them, and then talk about the situation? So co-regulation is another term that you all probably do really naturally as caregivers, but it's supporting your child through their self-regulation process. And this really goes along with creating that safe sensory environment, also them knowing they can turn to you as a trusted adult when they're having trouble regulating themselves. So this is found in providing a warm and responsive relationship, having that secure attachment with them, creating a safe and open environment, creating those sensory spaces where they might feel comfortable, but also knowing that they can express themselves. And then also teaching and coaching regulation skills. And this might come after a person or a child's able to regulate, but this is done through talking about the situation. What happened here? What made you feel uncomfortable or made you feel stressed? What is something that could have helped before it got to this point? And also modeling what regulation looks like. And there's a whole fact sheet on this that I include at the end if you're interested in learning more about co-regulation, but just being their support through that. So this is a great picture and going along with what we talked about. Regulating happens in the lower brain, the brainstem. And then going up, like relating to a child. And this just means giving them a hug or letting them know you're there with them through the experience. This is engaging their emotions and helping them feel safe. And then reasoning comes after that. So yeah, emotional regulation is a person's ability to identify and have agency or control over the emotional state and apply coping skills as they need to. So this is a learned upper brain function. So these are things that can be used when your child's in a regulated state to help them understand their emotions. You can see different things in this calming corner. And this can even be done before, a person reaches a meltdown level, like having them identify how they're feeling leading up to this. So you have like green, orange, yellow, to try to build their awareness of how they're feeling. But once a person reaches a meltdown point, this might be harder to do in the moment. There's something called the ALERT program. This is also based in occupational therapy. And this is a sensory program for a child to identify how their sensory system is feeling and how tools for self-regulation. So how's your engine running? Low, that means you're underregulated, less able to process the environment, you're tired. Just right means you're good. High means, you feel overwhelmed by the environment around you. And we also have heard of the zones of regulation: blue zone, green zone, yellow zone, red zone. These are all, I'm not going to go into them, but these are different tools that are used to help a child self-regulate. And to end, there can be so much that can be said about this, but behavior is what we see. That is how a child is acting on their environment with different actions. There's so much behind behavior, and every behavior has a purpose. But as we saw, sensory processing and a child's emotional regulation skills are so tightly tied to behavior. Sometimes they just don't have the tools, or their environment is too overwhelming, or they're not processing the environment correctly, and their behavior is showing that. So we have to really think about the intent. Is the child trying to get something out of the situation, or do they not just have the skills or the ability to cope with the environment around them? So taking a trauma-informed approach and also a sensory-informed approach can be helpful. So these are just some resources to consider. I really highly recommend reading The Whole Brain Child and The Body Keeps the Score. They're just such great resources, and they're dense, but very worth the read, I think. This is a research article that ties sensory information with trauma and sensory processing. If you're really interested in like the brain science behind things, this really goes into detail about the brain structures, but it is pretty dense to read. Here's the videos from the presentation I showed today. If you want to listen to podcasts, I have a few podcast recommendations. This is about the whole brain child's kind of the 3 R's we talked about. And this is from Dr. Daniel Siegel. If you're looking to get your child into therapy and you don't know where to start, Psychology Today has a really great search database where you can put in your zip code. And then after that, you can put in like the type of trauma you're interested in, your insurance, the child's age, things like that. So I think this is a good place to start if you're looking to find a therapist. And then this is more sensory information. If you want to learn more about sensory, All Things Sensory by Harkla is a really great podcast. And there's just 3 different topics I've included here. Is it sensory or is it behavior? Teaching your child to self-regulate using sensory strategies. So it goes into more depth about a lot of the things we talked about. And they have more videos online as well. Here's a free sensory checklist if you're interested. And it just has different questions you can look at. So you'd probably want to click on this one, sensory symptoms. And that has different symptoms for different types of sensory input. So you can see over responsive, under responsive. So you can look at this. And then also this is just more about co-regulation if you're looking for tools about co-regulation. So yeah, with that, just thank you everyone for tuning in. If you have any questions, never hesitate to reach out. I hope you learned something today, and have a good rest of your day. Thanks.